Welcome, everybody. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism. And let me just, okay. And it's my great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Ruth Franklin. Ruth is a book critic and former editor at the New Republic. Her first biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016, a Time Magazine Top Fiction Book of 2016, and a Best Book of 2016 by the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, NPR, and others. Franklin's work appears in many publications, including The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and Harper's. She's a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in Biography, a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Leon Levy Fellowship in Biography, and the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism. Her first book, A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, from 2011, was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Today, she and I will be speaking about her new book. Here it is, The Many Lives of Anne Frank, which was just published by Yale University Press in its Jewish Lives series. And if you don't know that series, it's really worth checking out. Full disclosure, I also just published a book in it, a biography of Alfred Dreyfus. But Ruth's book really fulfills the mission of the series, I think, by being both incredibly interesting, really centrally focusing on Jewish issues, and being very readable. So I highly recommend it. Before we start, just a word about how things will work today. We're going to have a discussion, Ruth and I, for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Please feel free to submit questions at any time while we're talking using the Q&A function at the bottom, and then I'll ask your questions. And I'll try to get to as many of them as I can, but apologies if I don't ask your question, because I'm sure we'll have too many for all of them. So okay, let's get started. Ruth, thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to see you.
Thanks so much for having me here, and I do apologize for the sound quality. I'm having technical difficulties with my vocal cords right now, but I'll try to be as audible as possible.
Okay, yeah, no, we can hear you. So yeah, drink the tea. Okay, so let's just start with just a general question of what drew you to the subject of Anne Frank?
So, as we were just talking a couple minutes ago, the diary is so omnipresent in American culture, especially, but not limited to American Jewish culture. And you and I were just talking about how we read the diary as children,
Yeah.
as so many Jewish children in America and around the world do, maybe especially in our generation. So Anne Frank was always there, kind of as a touchstone in the back of my mind. And then, in the 90s, especially the early 2000s, I started becoming aware of these news reports periodically that would, there would be news that missing pages from the diary had been located, or, other kinds of unexpected news about the diary. And I started becoming aware that it had existed as a book in different versions in a way that wasn't really part of the public conversation about the diary, which was very, the public conversation was still very much focused on Anne as a kind of icon and symbol, meaning so many different things to people, depending on their culture, their political context, the way in which they read her. And I started becoming aware that the more symbolic she seems to become, her face is on billboards and there's statues of her all over the world. But the more symbolic she seems to become, the less we're really aware of who she was as a person, and the special, really interesting qualities of her diary as a text that wasn't a kind of found object, as so many people still seem to believe, but a premeditated and carefully constructed Holocaust testimony. And so I
Mhm.
really wanted to try to put those two pieces together in this book and create an image of Anne that was, both human and iconic.
Yeah, I have to say, like when I heard, maybe a couple years ago that you were, this was in the works, that you were doing this, I at first thought, wow, does Anne Frank really exist? Was she a person beyond this book? So, it was an interesting thing to discover her in a very different way reading the book. I mean, she comes across really from your book as this flesh and blood figure and not this sort of saint of Holocaust forgiveness in a certain way, So that was really fascinating.
I really appreciate your saying that. And I love the way you phrase the question, does Anne Frank really exist? Because I think in so many ways, she kind of looms in our imagination as a kind of quasi-fictional character.
Yeah.
And part of that is, I mean, I'm not in any way, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying that Anne Frank was a fictional character. Obviously, she was a real person. But what I mean by that is that, especially through the adaptations, which, I'm sure we can talk about that, but also the ways that she's imagined by fiction writers as a character who survived, most famously by Philip Roth in The Ghostwriter. But
Mhm.
actually, so many different writers have given her kind of cameos in their work. I think we do see her as this almost fictional person.
Yeah, which actually brings me to something about the cover image of this, which is a kind of I don't know if you can tell in the audience, but it's almost like a piece of graffiti art. It's like a stencil that was probably painted on a building. And one notable thing, having written a book for the series, I know they ask you for images of the person, and you don't do that. If I'm not wrong, I don't think you include a photo of her in the book. And in fact, the frontispiece, you have to give the Yale Press an image for or recommend one for the frontispiece. And you give, it's actually the diary itself, not an image of Anne. So could you talk about that decision a little bit?
Yeah, so the image on the cover is a mural. It's a mural by a graffiti artist who goes by the moniker Bip Apollo. BIP stands for Believe in People, which is actually written on the side of this mural,
Mhm.
which seems a very Anne Frank appropriate moniker for him. The mural is actually in New Haven, not
Mhm.
far from Yale. I'm not even sure if it's still there, but I think it is. And I had in my mind that I wanted to use a piece of street art in the book somehow, just to emphasize how ubiquitous Anne Frank is, that you literally could be walking down the street and bump into a wall with her face. And at the
Mhm.
same time, I didn't want to I feel like we all know what Anne Frank looks like. We all have that image in our mind, the one that was on the book, that the edition that you and I probably read as kids, the very
Mhm.
sweet and childish picture of her with her hair with, in a barrette.
Mhm.
Um, we know those images. We can probably everyone who's attending here can probably conjure up a mental image of Anne Frank's face. And so I felt like it was on number one, it wasn't really necessary. And number two, I wanted to emphasize what we don't know about Anne Frank.
Mhm.
And that's why I chose to use the image that you showed of the diary. And it's an image from the Anne Frank house that shows the diary in many of its different versions. On the top of the image, it shows um, her notebooks, these notebooks in which she wrote the first version, the rough draft, as it were, of her diary. And then, yeah, so that's sort of and the top part of the photo shows that. And then what you see in the bottom left quadrant there are the loose pages on which she rewrote the diary from the beginning. And we can talk about her specific motivation in doing that, but she actually started again on these separate pieces of paper and wrote a whole new version of her diary.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to kind of, you know, implicitly convey the sense that, I kind of wanted the reader to put aside for a minute what they think they know about Anne Frank and be open to the idea that
Mhm.
she, in fact, had this other identity.
Yeah, and it almost, I mean, when I saw the cover and the graffiti picture, I almost thought, wow, okay, this is going to be a book also about representations of Anne Frank, about how about her, your title, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. It's also very much, at least half the book is really about her, the afterlives, the adaptations, which we'll come to in a minute. Okay, so this is you do really, I think, two things in the book, or many things, but among the things you do, you give a conventional biography of Anne in a sense. Trace, what we know about her life. But you also give what you maybe would call a biography of the book, a biography of the diary that traces the afterlife of the journal, its publication history, debates over the various adaptations, which I want to talk about. So how did you decide to structure it that way? Was that like did you know you wanted to do that as soon as you took on the project?
I didn't at all. In fact, it took a few years for me to figure out the structure of this book, which any writers who are listening will know that, especially I think, well, with nonfiction, the structure is so much of the kind of the narrative of the project, and it's really the most important part. So for around 3 years, I was doing research and taking notes sort of in the dark without knowing how this book was going to be put together. Except the one thing I knew that was that I didn't want it to be a conventional cradle
Mhm.
to grave biography. Um, even like the term cradle to grave, it's a cliche about the biography genre, but it feels especially poignant in terms of Anne Frank, because of course she doesn't even have a grave.
Yeah.
Uh, but there's so many reasons why a conventional biography of her just wouldn't work or be worth doing. And one reason is because everybody knows her story. Everybody knows her life story. Um, and I actually was standing in line at the airport when I had this kind of idea about what would eventually become the book structure in terms of the multiple perspectives. The reason I call it The Many Lives of Anne Frank, and of course, it's a little bit of an ironic title because we all only have one life and hers was so tragically short. Um, but she had many, many different identities, and the book goes through them. The book chooses 13 different ways of looking at Anne Frank, we could say. Starting when she's a child in Frankfurt and then moving through her years in Amsterdam when she first becomes a target of Nazi persecution. And each chapter is named one with the name of one of these identities: refugee, I call her a witness when she's first writing the diary, an artist when she's revising it. She becomes a prisoner after the raid on the annex when she's deported to Westerbork and then to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, where she dies. And the Bergen-Belsen chapter I chose to call Corpse,
Mhm.
with a deliberately ugly name to emphasize that that's what she was to the Nazis. She wasn't all of these other things that she is to us. To them, she was just a body to be
Yeah.
murdered. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I have to say, like, not, being someone who had, done research on her before, I have to say that I learned a lot that I didn't know before reading this, especially things that after the diary ends. So like what happens to her in Westerbork, for instance. I didn't know any of that. So did you like what were some of your sources for what happened to her? Are there other good biographies of her out there?
yeah, there are several biographies of her that have been written. One, probably the most comprehensive, is by Melissa Mueller, who's a German journalist.
Hmm.
There's also a biography by the writer Carol Ann Lee, and by Francine Prose, of course.
Hmm.
His book is a little bit shorter and mostly concerned, the biography aspect of the book is shorter and is mostly balanced towards the diary and the afterlife. Excuse me, I'll just take 1 second.
Yeah.
And there are sources. Of course, the diary ends just before the raid on the annex, and she stops writing a couple of days before being arrested. Um, and that's one of the criticisms that's been made traditionally of the diaries, that it doesn't really convey the full Holocaust experience.
Mhm.
The reader is sheltered from having to know what happened to Anne.
Yeah.
And because of that, those felt like especially important chapters of the book. And so there has been, one benefit of writing about somebody who is so iconic in stature is that many people who knew her or came into contact with her have written or recorded their memoirs. And so there's a lot of testimony um, of people who saw her in the camp, or who knew her before in childhood and then later saw her in the camp, or even women who didn't know her previously but happened to meet her there. And so
Mhm.
I relied heavily on those. But they also weren't enough to
Mhm.
draw the portrait that I wanted to of the world of those camps and what happened in them, especially Westerbork, which is a much less familiar story, I think, to Americans than what happened to people at Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen. That camp it was technically a transit camp, not a concentration camp or a death camp. And it had its own very unique culture and kind of systems that worked there. And then I found actually, even in the context of Auschwitz, there is a lot that I didn't understand about the differences between the treatment of women and the treatment of men, male prisoners, by the Nazis.
Yeah.
And realized this after, so, and in order to fill in some of the gaps in Anne's story, I read a lot of memoirs of women who had been in each of these camps, women who were hopefully around the same age as Anne, or who were from the Netherlands, or
Mhm.
otherwise who might have had an experience similar to her, and who were in the camps at the same time as she was. And so I built my picture of those camps out of their memoirs. I don't ever, I don't ever speculate in an imaginative way about things that happened to her. I think it's possible to conclude that if many women prisoners talk about something happening, then it's likely that she may have experienced it as well.
Yeah.
I don't make up scenes or otherwise imagine what happened to her there.
Yeah, and I learned a huge amount, and it's I was saying before this started that I just taught a course on representing the Holocaust in literature and film, and it's a problem that most of the records we have, most of the things are by people who survived the camp, so we don't really have many voices of people who didn't survive. One, I didn't teach this. I was saying because I figured the students had all read it already, but I taught the journal of Hélène Baer, a French who's sometimes compared to Anne Frank, so called the French Anne Frank. And it's very, very powerful to have that voice of someone who didn't survive and who didn't come
Yeah.
back. So, okay, so several versions of the diary exist. I mean, this was something also that I didn't really know before. So there's Anne's original diary, the version that she rewrote in hiding based on the original, but kind of more intended for publication. Then there's the version that her father, Otto, put together actually for publication after the war. And there are also like differences in the different translations. So could you just say a little bit about like what changed, especially between, the original, what she rewrote, and then what got published?
Absolutely. Well, this is, I think, the source of kind of the greatest confusion over the years, in terms of, who edited what and in what way. And Otto Frank especially has been kind of unfairly villainized by a lot of readers and critics who kind of assume that he censored Anne's criticisms of her mother, for instance, or also her thoughts about her developing body. And none of this is true, actually. And if
Mhm.
you look in the originally published version, the version that was originally published in America, anyway, you can see that all that stuff is there.
Mhm.
And I think what's much less understood is the way that Anne edited herself.
Mhm.
And since I'm here in my home office, I'm going to show on the screen the edition that I used, which is called the Critical Edition of Anne's Diary, and it shows the different versions top to bottom. So I'm just gonna here it is. I'm gonna find that. So basically, the reason this happened was because in March 1944. Anne and the other residents of the annex were listening to the radio, as they often did in the evening, and they heard a Dutch minister from the government in exile give a speech where he called for ordinary citizens to preserve their documents of the war years, their private documents, for inclusion in a future national archive. And he says in this very meaningful way that history can't be written on the basis of public documents alone. That in order for their descendants to truly understand what they went through as a nation during these years, they need documents, private documents like diaries and letters. And Anne records all this in her diary. She says the residents all made a rush at her diary immediately. They all understood that they had such a document. And she writes, wouldn't it be funny if 10 years from now people were told what we Jews ate and what we talked about and how we lived here? Okay, so but then she thinks about it for a while, and she thinks about it for a couple of months, and she realizes during this time that if her diary is going to serve this kind of function, if it's going to be a public document that goes into a public archive, in the version that she has doesn't work because it's too personal. And this version A, which I'll show you now, um, you can see I'm just trying to choose a good page here that shows them all. Okay, so here's a page that shows on the top is version A. This is Anne's original version. Then the middle where it's labeled B, this is her revision.
Mhm.
And then the bottom labeled C is the version that auto published. And so what she does is she goes back from to the beginning and she rewrites it because she's realized that version A, it's much more like a diary that you or I might write. It's
Mhm.
very personal, it's sporadic. It's got all kinds of things that didn't make it into the final version, like she daydreams about going shopping, and she makes lists of what she's going to buy, or she writes all these really catty notes about her classmates,
Mhm.
all kinds of stuff like that that she realized didn't belong in the kind of testimonial document that she
Mhm.
planned on writing. And so she goes back to the beginning, and not only does she cut all of that stuff out, and the main changes to the diary that we see are in this early part. She cuts all
Mhm.
that stuff out, but she actually adds new entries where she gives more context about the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands, explaining, for instance, in an early version, she writes about going to an ice cream shop with her friends. And in version B, she adds that she and her friends are going to that ice cream shop because it's one of the only ones where they're allowed to go because they're Jewish. Stuff like that.
Mhm.
But the most important change is that she removed from her version, she removed the entries about her romance with Peter,
Mhm.
Peter Van Pels, the son of the other family whom she was in hiding with. I'm sure anybody who's read the diary remembers this as kind of a highlight of the diary because it's so sweet, and is so kind of typical of adolescence and really, I think, makes Anne extremely sympathetic and relatable as we watch her go through this crush and its eventual consummation. She took all of that out, and her father made the decision to put it back in.
Mhm.
So it's much more a question of what did he add that she wanted to subtract rather than what he took out that she wanted to.
Yeah, that was fascinating for me because I don't know where I had this opinion, but like somehow I always I sort of thought that, oh, he was this sort of, suppressing editor, Otto. That was a real revelation that, in fact, he added more stuff that she maybe didn't, intend for publication. That was really interesting. So another thing I learned was that she did a lot of other writing besides the diary in hiding. And in fact, you call her an artist, which I think is, that's a chapter title. So can you just tell, she wrote fairy tales and fiction. First of all, like was it good? You read all of it. Or what does it help us understand about her?
I would say, definitely some of it is good. It's very poignant. Cynthia Ozick has this wonderful line in her essay about Anne Frank, imagining her as a mature writer with a long line of novels and journalism coming from her pen. And I think it's very, very likely that she would have developed into a wonderful fiction writer. And what we see here are her juvenilia, just like with any other writer. Um, but I think, for one thing, it's interesting that she's so interested in writing fairy tales, rather than more realistic type fiction. And many of these fairy tales can be read as kind of parable-like stories about life in hiding. There's one in particular that I describe in the book called The Wise Old Gnome. And
Mhm.
it's about one elf, a girl elf, and a boy elf. The girl is always happy and positive all the time, and the boy elf is always miserable and negative. And this wise old gnome comes and shuts them up together in a cabin for an indefinite period of time. And at the end of it, they emerge improved for the time that they've spent together. Um, and I think it's hard not to read that as kind of a parable of life in hiding, life under
Mhm.
confinement, and imagining, how she might have felt herself to have benefited, at least as a writer from this experience.
Mhm. Great. So I want to remind people that feel free to submit questions anytime using the Q&A function, and I will ask them in a little bit. So I want to talk now. I have a few questions about the Jewish dimension of Anne's life and about the her afterlife, and the afterlife of the diary. So first of all, how religious a person was Anne? You take that on in the book, and specifically, how Jewish was she?
Well, she was Jewish
Yeah,
by virtue of her birth. She was just as Jewish as anybody else.
yeah.
But religious is another question. Her father came from a very assimilated family, German Jews who had lived in Frankfurt on his mother's side for generations. Her mother's family was more traditionally religious. Her mother was raised Orthodox and was a little more traditionally religious. But Anne doesn't seem to have been very interested in that aspect of Judaism.
Mhm.
She, there are very few mentions in the diary of any kind of religious observance. There's one mention of Yom Kippur. There's one mention of lighting Hanukkah candles, and there's a mention of Shabbat candles, and that's it. Uh,
Mhm.
she does write about God and
Mhm.
wanting to be close to God, imagining herself being close to God. But she's writing about God in a way that's not really Jewish. It's almost more of like a pantheistic God in nature type of vision of God. She imagines, being able to go outside and be under the stars, which, I think is also very poignant considering that nature and being outside was the one thing she,
She could. I mean,
absolutely lacked. Yeah.
it's fascinating because it's really very similar to Ellen Baer, who was from the same milieu and the same exact age, and it's a similar kind of um, you know sort of aspiration towards religion, towards God that is quasi-Christian almost. I mean, would you go that far with her?
I would go that far. And in fact, There's this really interesting book that Anne read. I mean, the book itself is not that interesting, but it's interesting that Anne read it and identified with it. And it's a memoir by an American woman named Alice Bretz, who goes blind.
Hmm.
And we know Anne read this because she copies out passages from it in a kind of commonplace book that she kept while she was in the annex. She copied, and so Alice Bretz goes blind and writes a lot in this book about how her belief in God sustains her through this. And these are some of the passages that Anne
Yeah.
copies. And it's a very kind of New Testament
Yeah.
conception of God.
So, okay, so a lot of the book is about the adaptation, the kind of controversy over the adaptation of the book, which I think gets at this central question about the Jewishness of the diary. And I'm thinking also of your recent, you just published an op-ed, which is in the New York Times, which was also kind of about this question. So, could you just say a little bit about the controversy over adapting the diary for the stage and the question of how Jewish to make it?
Yeah. So I think this is really the central question. This is the central tension that animates our conversations about the diary. And I want to say, we just talked about how Anne wasn't traditionally Jewish in a religious sense, but, in a cultural sense, what we might,
Yeah.
as we would call that today, she certainly did feel herself to be Jewish, especially, in the face of the Nazi persecution. Perhaps she might not have as much before that started, but once she was targeted as a Jew, she felt a sense of solidarity and rage.
Right, which not all, not everyone did. So I think that says
Yeah.
something about her character at the time, that made her more Jewish.
Yeah, I think that it's right to say that. And in fact, so then there's a passage in the diary where she talks about the persecution of the Jews throughout history. She says, all through the ages, we Jews have had to suffer. And this, I think the most controversial, the most dubious thing I would say that the playwrights who initially adapted the diary for Broadway did here was they take that passage and they deliberately change it. Instead of Anne saying, Jews have always had to suffer, it gets changed to something like, throughout history, all peoples have had to suffer, sometimes one people, sometimes another.
Mhm.
And, there's been a lot of debate over the years over who exactly made this change and for what reason. Um, but what's interesting is that, with the exception of the playwrights, both the producer and the director who of the original Broadway production were Jewish. They were American Jews. And I think it's indicative of this kind of anxiety that American Jews felt, during the 50s and these post-war years, when it must have felt, quite vulnerable to
Mhm.
insist on one's separateness as a Jew, right?
Mhm.
Nobody wanted to do that. That was exactly what got them in so much trouble.
Right, right. And I think that, we have a tendency now to project our contemporary understanding of Jewish identity, the way, people affirm Jewish identity now onto this, mid-century moment. And that's totally wrong. I mean, coming out of the war, I think, the American Jewish community did not feel as, confident and powerful, certainly as now.
I mean, how could it have,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the tendency to make the diary into a text with universal appeal, we see it in the initial American publication of the diary. It's an American tendency.
Right.
And it's all over. It was Doubleday who published the book in the US. It's all over their marketing. That it's in the original reviews of the book, including one written for the New York Times Book Review by Meyer Levin, who was
Mhm.
later, going to make himself famous for insisting on how that the diary had to be a Jewish play. But here we see him in the Times talking about Anne's feelings as being he says, of the purest universality. The
Mhm.
Franks are just like any other people, they're like our neighbors down the street.
Yeah.
Um, and I
And,
think,
and in fact, you say in the book, I mean, it was marketed as a Christmas present,
I
right?
know,
In the
not
year
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I'm
incredible.
already picture like who's going to be unwrapping the diary of Anne Frank under their Christmas tree, but
Right. But people obviously did. And, that tension, I think, was already, I mean, I think Otto himself was, it seemed like to me, was torn also between wanting to make the diary universal in order to reach more people, but he also, it seemed like, did not want to lose the Jewish specificity of it. How did he think about that?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think he realized that that was, he wouldn't have called it this, but it was a catch-22. Um,
Hmm.
he wanted the diary to reach the greatest number of people. He wanted Anne's message to go out into the world and be understood in the broadest possible way as a message of, peace and tolerance in all contexts, not limited to anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
But at the same time, he felt, I think that we can read a little bit of anxiety
Hmm.
into his words, his letters, especially as the diary is becoming embraced as a universal text. He starts to realize that,
Hmm.
in doing this, it's
Hmm.
compromising its Jewish character in a way. The more Anne becomes universally relatable, the less we need to identify her as Jewish. And of course, as I say in that op-ed, it's a sign of anti-Semitism
Hmm.
that a Jewish girl can't be seen as universally relatable.
Yeah.
That aspect of her identity has to be played down.
Yeah. So what would be, I'm trying to think like, all right, so let's talk about, later uses of the diary or later adaptations. You know, you talk in the book, they're including ones that enlist Anne's image or the diary itself to make statements about Gaza, for instance, or other political issues, often ones that are explicitly anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. Can you talk a little bit about some of the, problems of, using the diary specifically in that and for these political, in political ways like that?
Yeah. I mean, the question of Zionism, I think, is particularly tricky because one thing I try not to do, in the book or at any point, is to impute to Anne political views that she didn't express
Hmm.
herself.
Hmm.
And in fact, she was not a political person. She had friends who were active in Zionist clubs in
And
the
even her sister, right, had a fantasy of going to, right? Didn't
That's
her?
right. Her
Yeah.
sister hoped to become a midwife in Palestine, which was one, possible way that people, that young Jewish teenagers could volunteer for the Zionist movement, which, at the time, of course, was focused on establishing the state of Israel and building it up.
Mhm.
Um, and Anne thought that she could not understand why her sister wanted to do this. She wanted to go to London and Paris and study art history and wear beautiful clothes. Um,
Mhm.
so at the very end of her diary, she does start writing things, especially about feminism, that are more
Mhm.
politically oriented. But, at a time when other kids were interested in Zionism, she
Mhm.
wasn't. So, I just put that aside. Of course, we can't know how her experiences during the war might have changed her perspective. And of course, many, many Jews who weren't Zionist before the Holocaust happened were,
Mhm.
became Zionists after the war and settled in Israel, which was one of the only places
Yeah.
that took them in at that point, including, some of her high school friends, although interestingly, not her father, who
Mhm.
who was a professed Zionist, but chose to settle eventually in Switzerland and to live his life there.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
But he did visit the state of Israel many times, you talk about, and yeah.
yes, he was a supporter of
Yeah.
Israel, definitely.
Mhm.
Um, in the book, I talk about the last chapter of the book, which deals with her identity in the political world, is called Pawn. And I thought about looking at the different ways that people use her politically. I thought about calling it, activist or crusader. And in the end, I settled on pawn because my sense is truly that usually when people invoke Anne as a symbol for their cause, they are not interested in her historical reality.
Mhm.
They're simply using her to lend gravitas or whatever to whatever it is that they want to support. That said, I think, we would be irresponsible
Mhm.
not to notice some of the resonances between, some things that are happening in our current moment, especially, I'm thinking about the migrant crisis around the world, including, the deportation of immigrants in the US,
Mhm.
and just not to see the resonances there. But I
Mhm.
think also at the same time, it's important to talk about those resonances and to learn from history
Mhm.
without um, implying identification, without
Mhm.
saying this is the same as that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's, I think, the nuance that sometimes gets lost in these conversations.
So, do you think that there's a right way to use the diary or Anne Frank's memory to talk about? I mean, there's clearly probably a wrong way to do it, but is there a right way? Like, how do you think, let's say, even leaving, the war in Gaza aside, but talking about, let's say, the migrant crisis, what would be like a respectful way to use the diary to talk about that?
I just think that I think for one thing, it's, useful to really look at the historical parallels and talk about, both the things that are parallel and the ways in which the situation is different.
Mhm.
But I think the most important part of that is not to let anti-Semitism get lost in this conversation.
Mhm. Mhm.
Sometimes when the diary is presented in updated ways. For instance, there's a film called Where is Anne Frank? That where an explicit goal is to make Anne relevant today, to make her message relevant today. And the message is one of sympathy for Syrian migrants in Amsterdam. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I think that Anne's message is relevant, continues to be relevant today, um, for Jews as well as for
Mhm.
other persecuted groups. And I think that, that we are doing a disservice to her memory when we don't say that part out loud and we just focus on the other aspects.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience, and so I invite you. Please use the Q&A function, and I will try to get through because we have a bunch already. Someone pointed out that there's a new exhibit opening at the Center for Jewish History in New York, and I've read a little bit about it. It actually reconstructs the annex in the secret annex, which you can't even really see if you go to the Anne Frank house, I think, right? So this is a really amazing opportunity to see it. So what do you think that exhibits like that are trying to show? What do you think their, goal is and message?
Well, the purpose of this exhibit, which opened last week, and I have seen it, is really to bring something like the experience of visiting the annex to a wider number of people. And in that way, it's very, very consonant with the mission of the Anne Frank House,
Mhm.
which is, the universalist mission that Anne's
Mhm.
message, Anne's story should be experienced and understood by the greatest possible number of people. And at the same time, recognizing that there are many Americans who would love to see the Anne Frank House who can't afford to travel to Amsterdam. Um,
Mhm.
and the exhibit at the Center for Jewish History also is accessible to the disabled, which the Anne Frank House is not.
Mhm.
But, as you pointed out, there's a really important difference in that the way it's presented, the reconstruction of the annex at the Center for Jewish History is done, with the exact same proportions and everything as in the original building in Amsterdam. But whereas the rooms in Amsterdam are empty, what we see at the Center for Jewish History is they're furnished in a way, not with the exact furniture, but in the way that they were when the Franks were in hiding there. And so it is, kind of it has a different aura,
Mhm.
kind of homey in a way that the
Yeah.
very empty and dark annex is not homey.
Yeah. So are we having a kind of Anne Frank moment right now, between your book and this exhibit, and why do you think that is?
I mean, maybe I think, we're kind of always having an Anne Frank moment because the diary is always being rediscovered by, discovered by new people or rediscovered by people who haven't read it in a long time. But,
Mhm.
if we're having an Anne Frank moment now, I think, based on the kinds of conversations that I've been having, is that there's a lot of anxiety about where our country is headed under the
Mhm.
new administration.
Mhm.
And a desire to learn from um,
Mhm.
Anne Frank's story, and hopefully being able to prevent innocent people from being persecuted.
Yeah. So, do you feel like her memory, often the only thing that people remember about her is that line, people, I'm going to misquote it, but, people are good after, I still
Out
believe
of
that,
everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart.
yeah. And you don't actually, give that line that much attention in the book, which is interesting because it's the thing that. So, do you feel like that is an appropriate, takeaway from the diary, or is that part of the attempt to, um, flatten it out to erase the anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people find that line to be deeply motivational. And the problem is when it's flattened out to be Anne's entire message or her entire story. I think it's important to remember that, that the line is almost never presented in context. And in fact, it takes place in the middle of a passage that's quite dark. She says, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. But then she goes on to say, I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the suffering of millions. And, there's been a lot of talk. Holocaust scholars and others have said with a lot of confidence that if Anne had survived the camps, she wouldn't have still believed that people were truly good at heart. And
Mhm.
my perspective on that is just that we can't say with confidence anything about a future surviving Anne. We just don't know. But that even in the annex, our idea about people being really good at heart wasn't quite as simple as we perceive it to be.
Mhm. Yeah. So, a question, because Yale houses the Fortunoff Archive of Holocaust Testimonies, and a question from the legendary archivist there. Did you use any testimonies, any video testimonies, anything beyond published written?
Yes, yes. I used a lot of testimonies. I don't think I used any from the Fortunoff archive, but I used some from some audio testimonies from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and also video testimonies from Yad Vashem.
Mhm.
Again, in building out not just the story of Anne and the camps, but also building out the story of what was going on in Amsterdam outside the annex while she was in hiding, what
Mhm.
was happening to other people who were in hiding, or what was happening in general. Jews were getting rounded up and deported in all kinds of um,
Mhm.
horrifying ways. Yeah.
And just a plug for the Fortunoff that it does, the archive does have many testimonies by people around Anne's age who experienced similar things. So, and those can be accessible at Yale. So, a question about images of Anne like this one on the cover, graffiti art. Um, do you, is there something offensive, do you think, about using her image in that way? Do you think that is that, or is your even putting that on the cover a comment on that, would you say? Or do you think, do you feel like there should be almost like a kind of sacralization of Anne's image?
Well, I guess my putting it on the cover was a little bit of a comment, but I don't actually feel that it's inappropriate. I feel that it makes us anxious. I think we see the tension between the sacralized image and the one that's on the wall. But I'm completely opposed to the sacralization of her image. I don't think that she should be made into be some kind of either a Jewish saint or a secular saint. Um,
Mhm.
and I think there's so much art inspired by Anne, not just visual art, but novels, works of music that set her diary, in oral form or others, lots and lots of visual art that does interesting things with her image. And I think that all this is a good thing. It's testimony to the power of her image. It's extraordinary power to move people worldwide in all kinds of situations.
Mhm.
And I've been in touch with the graffiti artist who did the image that appears on the cover. And I think he's a very, very talented artist, and I know that he intended that image as an homage to her.
Mhm. And are there any um, films about her that you think are particularly good? Someone mentions in the questions there's a short film about the Anne Frank gift shop.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually haven't seen that one yet. It's on my list of Anne Frank influenced materials. Um, there's a really lovely little film by the Israeli filmmaker Chen Drachman, which I talk about a little bit in the book. It's called The Book of Ruth. It has nothing to do with me. And it's available. It's available for streaming online. It's about a 14-minute film, and I highly recommend that. Um, there's um, there's a film called Anne Frank Remembered. That's a documentary that has a lot of testimony by people who knew her. Um, and there's one other that I just had in my mind. Oh, there's one called Anne Frank Parallel Stories.
Mhm.
That I think is really interesting. It's not about her specifically, but it's about what we were discussing of the stories of other girls and women like her who had similar experiences.
Mhm. Okay, there's a question from a colleague who teaches international human rights, and I'm just going to read it exactly as he wrote it. I end every course with the full quote you were discussing a minute ago about being good at heart. But I either leave out or discuss that line about everyone being good at heart. It's lovely but simplistic and hard to believe. The line that is powerful is this: I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out. That remains as powerful an expression of the meaning of hope as any I know. I wonder what you think of the significance of that concluding line.
I agree. I think that that's a very important line. But I don't want to dismiss the idea of people being good at heart. And I, you know, that I find that those lines, just as overused as anybody else, and I groan when I see it on Instagram, or whatever. But I
Mhm.
came to see them differently when I was doing some research about South African political prisoners who were inspired by Anne, including Nelson Mandela and Ahmed Kathrada, who actually read the diary when they were in prison on Robben Island. And somehow this was one of the few books they had access to. They passed it around, they copied out passages. Kathrada actually, and the passage about that starts with the good at heart quote and continues through the line that you just read, Maury, is
Mhm.
one of the ones that Kathrada copied out.
Mhm.
And seeing it like that in that context made me look at it differently. And I
Mhm.
think, when one is in the position that they were in, and later, um, Mandela and Kathrada both spoke about how inspiring they had found the diary when they were in
Mhm.
prison. In their position, I think that it's a very powerful political statement to believe that people might be good at heart. And
Mhm.
if you're talking about, if you're trying to rebuild your society from the ground up, you kind of have to believe that.
Mhm. Um, so a question about the stage adaptation, which I think is still performed in schools, that same one from the 1950s, right? I mean, is that and
Actually, a revision of
oh,
it.
it's a revision. Okay. So
I'm sure they're both still performed, but there's a revision that was done in the 90s in response to some of the criticism that had been made of the.
okay, and is it better? Yeah. So what do you think of those stage, like, those stage adaptations and, should they be done in school? What do you think?
I think a lot of kids seem to have a very, very meaningful experience when participating in a performance of the diary.
Hmm.
I think the new version is truer to Anne's spirit. Um,
Hmm.
it sort of silently addresses a lot of the major complaints made about the original, including the downplaying of Anne's Jewishness.
Hmm.
You can still see the original. The original is the one that was made into the film adaptation. So
Hmm.
that's, still very much out in the world. It
Hmm.
seems that, a lot of teachers use the diary as a pedagogical tool. And I mean specifically the play,
The play, yeah.
be a way that people relate to her story.
And what do you think about, I mean, there's controversy about whether the book should be mandatory in public schools or even, banned in some public schools. I mean, what do you think about that? Like,
Yeah, so I just put in my website address into the chat actually in case people have questions that don't get answered here or just want to, send me
yeah,
an
so it's Ruth
email.
Frank, in case you're not, maybe the chat might not be visible,
Oh,
but it's ruthfranklin.net,
yeah,
right?
very easy to remember, ruthfranklin.net. So feel free to, email me your questions through the website. Um, Yeah, so with the book being banned in schools, this is a whole other, very complicated thing that mostly has to do with the graphic adaptation and its supposed LGBTQ content. And everybody who is going, what at this, it has to do with a passage in which Anne describes she's remembering a sleepover with her best friend, in which she remembers asking if they could touch each other's breasts. And her friend says no, and that's the end of it. And then there's another line where she talks about her love of the female body. And it's very clear from the context that she's looking at an art history book and talking about her love of the female body. And the graphic adaptation also makes that clear. And so I think it's really a sign of bad faith by this book is targeted by this group Moms for Liberty, quote unquote, and I think other conservative activist groups, as promoting inappropriate content. And I think that this is, it's really a travesty that they've co-opted the Diary of Anne Frank into their anti-gay agenda.
Mhm. Okay, there's one person who's mentioned a couple times about the importance of the fiction writer Ida Fink, and I totally agree with that. She's an amazing, amazing writer, and I encourage everyone to read her stories if they haven't already. I teach them in my class, but we're almost out of time, so I'll just ask you someone else's last question, which is how doing this research and writing this book has changed you as a person and a writer.
That's an interesting question that I haven't I haven't been asked before. Um, I will say that, the world of the last few years, especially post October 7th, has been an interesting time to be thinking so much about the story of Anne Frank and its meaning for us in the present day. Um, and one message I take from it is, this the sense from we see Otto Frank. I talked a little bit about the immigration issues, the question where of the sorry of their family as refugees and as migrants. And we see the Jews in the Netherlands, many of whom were German refugees, getting together as a community in the wake of the Nazi rise to power and the growing danger for Jews in Nazi Germany. We see them often getting together to kind of share information and pool their resources and trying to understand what's happening to them and are they in danger. And that's a tendency that I've also seen in Jews in the US post October 7th. And I think if I hadn't been spending so much time thinking about Anne Frank's story, I might have not have seen it from that particular perspective.
Okay, that's great. So I just want to plug again The Many Lives of Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin. And I want to say thank you. That was a really just a fascinating discussion. It was so great to get to talk to you. And you can't hear everyone applauding, but I will applaud on behalf of everybody. So thank you, Ruth, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. I assume you're on the mailing list for the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism, but for some reason you aren't, you can go to our website and sign up. And I look forward to seeing you all at future events. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me here, Maury, and I apologize again for the terrible condition of my voice.
No, you did a great job. All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks, Ruth.